Hello, my name is Allison Goodspeed, and I'm doing a presentation on the Battle of Crete for Professor Maniates History 216 Introduction to World War II class, section W01X. In this presentation, I'm going to address the who, what, when, where, and why behind the Battle of Crete, which is the first time that the Luftwaffe paratroopers, also known as the Flieger Corps, were put into action. I'm going to begin by reading an excerpt from Jump into Hell by Franz Kurowski. This was a song said to be sung by one of the German paratroopers the morning that the Luftwaffe began their drop into Crete. It's believed that this was inspired by the color of the sunrise on the horizon as they were coming in on the plains. I will read it first in German and follow it with the English translation immediately after. Rot scheint die Sonne fertig gemacht. Wer weiß, ob sie morgen für uns auch noch lacht. Werft an die Motoren, schiebt voll Gas hinein. Startet los, fliegt an. Heute geht es zum Feind. An die Maschinen, an die Maschinen. Kamerad, da gibt es kein Zurück. Fern im Osten stehen dunkle Wolken. Komm mit und sage nicht. Komm mit. The sun shines red. We're ready to go. Who knows if she'll smile for us again tomorrow? Start up the engine. Give her throttle. Let's go. Head out. Today we meet the enemy. To the plains. To the plains. Comrade, there's no turning back. There are dark clouds in the east. Come along. Don't hesitate. Come along. The Battle of Crete began on May 20th and officially ended on June 2nd in 1941. The battle itself was slated to start May 17th, but had to be postponed due to refueling or getting resources together on the German side. The Battle of Crete happened on, you guessed it, the island of Crete, which is located in the Mediterranean Sea. The island itself is north of Africa, slightly southeast of mainland Greece, and slightly southwest of Turkey. Those that were involved in the battle were the Allied forces on Crete, which consisted of the Anzacs, which are the New Zealanders forces stationed on the island, some British forces that had come from Africa, and some of the local Cretan residents and citizens that were still on the island. The Axis powers involved were mainly the German Luftwaffe forces. The reason why the Germans, namely Hitler, decided that they wanted Crete was because it was a tactical advantage for the Axis powers. I'll expand on that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. But how is it that these two sides are going to go to battle? The German Luftwaffe forces, also known as the Flieger Corps portion of the paratroopers, are going to come in by air, but they will also have some naval ships as a secondary attack force. The Allies will consist of mainly land and foot forces, as well as a sizable force of naval ships. The Battle of Crete The island of Crete was considered as the gateway of the Mediterranean Sea due to its location. Seeing as it was one of the most important islands that the Allies had control of, it served as an air base and a refueling station for many of the forces that were being sent towards the campaign in northern Africa, but also for the forces that were passing through. 4 of the major points of the Battle of Crete, which are pointed out to you by the arrows on the map from left to right, are Malim, Kanya, Rethymnon, and Heraklion. Crete itself is a rocky, mountainous island that is approximately 160 miles long. Putting that into perspective, that is just 10 miles short of the distance if you were to go from Muskegon to Ann Arbor. According to John Bowman's article in Britannica titled Crete, the island consists of 4 main groups of mountains, one of which coming to the highest peak of 8,058 feet above sea level. There is also a plain located in the middle of the island, spanning an estimated 18 miles. Bowman also mentions that the coastline is all beach terrain, both sandy and pebble, and there are also a few small rivers, a couple of natural springs, ponds, and 1 natural freshwater lake. In modern-day Crete, there are a few artificial lakes that had been made on the island as well. Crete also has its fair share of foliage, ranging from flowers, due to its temperature and climate, and palm trees. There are some cedars on the west side of the island as well, too. To paint an even more vivid picture of what the troops were fighting in, the climate was variable. They had relatively mild winters, where temperatures are cooler, but they also have a lot of hot, dry summers with an average of approximately 25 inches of rain per Bowman. With this topographical information in mind, the troops of both Allies and Luftwaffe found themselves in territory that isn't what they're used to from their motherland, save for maybe New Zealand and Australia. So what made Crete so desirable? According to Hitler's initial thoughts, he wasn't going to conquer Crete because he felt that it was an unnecessary move in his plans. However, after talking with some of his closest generals, supervisors, people like that, he felt that he needed to change his mind due to the tactical advantages that Crete offered to the Axis powers. 1, it would help in the triumph of the Western territories that Hitler had his eyes on due to its prime real estate location. The island was already compromised with bases that were used for refueling the Allied forces, but also the air bases that were located there would allow for Hitler to have more forces stationed within the immediate area. The Allies were using it as a base of sending more forces to northern Africa, which was not looked at as a great thing for the Axis powers. Hitler also decided that because Britain absolutely refused to accept defeat and make peace with Germany, he would use it as a learning lessons of sort for the British. He was also talked into it by the Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe Fliegerkorps Commander General Kurt Student. General Kurt Student was a fighter pilot during World War I, which helped to influence his selection as the commander of the XI, or 11th Fliegerkorps. The Fliegerkorps were known as the elite forces of the Luftwaffe and were known to be the best of the best. They only took volunteers, and once they were into the program or the training, they would be trained to do everything plus some. Student was a large advocate for aerial warfare as he believed that the element of surprise would allow for the gain of the upper hand in battle. He was the first one to initially suggest the idea of using the Luftwaffe to Hitler for the Battle of Crete, to which Hitler had a very leery sense of that because he did not like the idea of subjecting his ultimate surprise to the rest of the world to see so soon. However, after some more arguments and points coming from Hermann Göring, who also would have liked to use the Luftwaffe in this attack, Hitler decided that it would be a great idea to take Crete and put it under the command of the Axis powers. Student himself, after the battle, did not receive any medals for any of his actions due to the losses sustained, which will be touched on towards the end of the presentation, as it also cost Hitler the element of surprise for later battles and a lot of men. The Luftwaffe were not used again for any invasions after this. Hitler decided to disband them and make it so there were not so many losses in any of the other battles that were being made. So while the Axis powers, or Luftwaffe in this case, were under the command of General Kurt Student, the Allied forces were under the overall command of Admiral Andrew Cunningham. Cunningham was told that his primary objectives for this battle were to prevent a seaborne assault on the island and to also protect the communications coming to and from it. Under these orders, he created the defensive forces named A, B, C, D, and Relief Force A1. These forces were made up of many different types of ships, depending on where the groups would later be stationed. Force A was made up of battleships Queen Elizabeth and Barnum and 5 destroyers. Force B had cruisers Gloucester and Fiji and 2 destroyers. Force C had anti-air cruisers Dido and Coventry with 4 destroyers. Force D had Dido's sister ships Naiad and Phoebe and 2 destroyers. Phoebe ended up developing a defect before battle and was actually replaced with the Australian cruiser Perth. And finally, Relief Force A1 consisted of the group of ships named Warspite, Valiant, the cruiser Ajax, 8 destroyers, the cruiser Formidable, and they were all held at Alexandria. There were also some motor torpedo boats that were supplied by the island of Crete for use, as well as a mine layer and a submarine. Admiral Cunningham controlled all of these forces from land, as he felt that would be the best choice for his battle. So the forces that were put together for the purpose of protecting the island from the incoming attack by the Luftwaffe, which were A, B, C, D, and Relief Force A1, were all positioned in a way that would be able to help maintain the defense around the area. A was positioned in such a way that it could intervene with the Italian forces should they try to intervene. B was used to deploy between the Capes Sapienza and Matapcan after it would first land the infantry battalion support onto the island on May 15th. C was positioned on the northeast coast of the island, while D was to cover the northwest portion of the island, and A1 was left on standby by Alexandria, Egypt, in case they were needed. Some additional forces that were used were the mine layer Abdiel and the submarine Rorqual to help lay mines to help discourage any Axis naval ships to come within the areas they were working to defend. Crete was also able to supply some motor torpedo boats that would run out trying to distract the enemy ships by harassing them. They could also use the guns on there to help try to take out some of the forces as well. Although the Allied powers and their allies within themselves were overall controlled by Cunningham, the Cree force was looking up to their established commander, Major General Bernard Freyberg. Freyberg, like Student, participated in World War I and had earned many different awards and decorations for his actions. He was actually wounded 9 times throughout his military career between 1914 and 1937, which is when he was forced into early retirement due to a heart condition that they had found. Lucky for him, however, he was able to reverse the orders and return to an active status to be able to serve overseas. Freyberg volunteered his services to New Zealand, where he initially had moved to when he was 2 with his parents, where he was then appointed to serve the 2nd New Zealand Division, which served campaigns in Africa, Greece, and Italy. After the Battle of Crete, Freyberg was criticized for the end results of the battle by many. However, he was also a greatly admired figure with his men due to his diligence of being concerned for their welfare and readiness to jump into the fray whenever needed. Because of Major General Bernard Freyberg, the Cree force stood tall and the morale gave them a sense of purpose, willingness to continue the fight, and the faith in their own abilities. So, preparing for battle, Allied forces had realized that the Axis powers were doing a lot of communicating with Enigma, or coding machines. These machines would put together a combination of letters, which could be decoded into finding out the actual message that was being sent or passed along, sort of like a Morse code. They were working to crack these codes diligently at Bletchley Park, which was a manor in Britain. They came to realize that many of the intercepted codes contained repeating information, such as name, rank, the recipient or addressee, so on and so forth, which actually aided the process significantly. They used two different types of decoding methods, one being the bomb method and the other being the crib method. The bomb method was a method where they would test different letter substitutions and combinations, working to find out where the Enigma machine's rotors were placed to compose the message. They have a cycle of approximately 17,516 different positions that they could be set during these compositions, which made some decryptions more difficult than others. The crib method came into play from the term coined from the old school English term for an illegal guided translation of Latin and Greek. They called it this because this method would not have worked without German cooperation, which was more or less the laziness or carelessness of the operator-composer of the message. Many different types of keys were used during Enigma work. The photo you see here from World War II Multimedia Database is a picture of the NCR N530 Enigma decryption machine, which was used to help decode many of these keys. Some of the main naval keys that were used during or prior to the Battle of Crete were Barracuda, which Bletchley had used for high-level signals during ops and was never broken. Pink, a high-level Luftwaffe key that was only broken after a year of use, but then the Germans somehow got themselves back together and it was rarely broken after that initial incident. And the green key, which was the German Army Home Administration key. It had been broken 13 times during the war from the codebreakers, as well as with some additional help from the German prisoners of war. Some other miscellaneous keys that were used were Shark, which was an Atlantic U-boat key that was unbreakable during February to December of 1942, and Gestapo, which was never broken. Due to the decoding, Bletchley coined terms for the two forms of mistakes that were found. He termed them arrival tip and sillies, two different spellings for sillies, one with an S-I-L-L-I-E-S, and the second with C-I-L-L-I-E-S. The arrival tip mistakes were results of brainwaves that allowed the decoders to guess the operator that typed out the message and often revealed accurate results. After they would set the rotor rims, they would place them in the slots that had the uppermost selected letters. The letters would form the first three letters of the encryption, which would result in revealing the rotor settings. The settings themselves would not change much for the first few years of the war. Sillies were the careless errors due to the keyboard arrangement. It required operators to choose three letters from the first group. Operators, instead of tapping at random, would run their finger in somewhat monotonous patterns, like an X pattern, for example, which on their keyboards could result in producing QAY and WSX. Some operators did attempt to make their letter combinations into things like AAA, DDD, KAT, and EVA, but were quickly tossed out by the authority figures. Due to these decryptions, the Allies were able to determine the actions and movements of German forces before their impending invasion of Crete. The Battle of Crete consisted of many different types of naval vessels, such as cruisers, battleships, destroyers, and motor torpedo boats. But with the Germans, seeing as they were planning an airborne assault, were using the paratroopers that were being dropped from planes, as well as the Stuka dive bombers, to try to soften up the landing for their Luftwaffe. The picture on the top right, provided by the site nationalinterest.org, is a Stuka bomber plane. It is said that these planes were very difficult to learn and maneuver, but the pilots were some of the best aerial fighters of World War II after they had learned it. Moving down to the battleship Queen Elizabeth, which is to the left, it is known as one of the biggest pieces of pride to the British Navy. To the right of that is the destroyer-class ship, this specific one being the HMS Greyhound. Moving towards the bottom left picture, this was the cruiser Fiji. And the final picture on the bottom right is an example of the motor torpedo boat. These were used as scouting vessels and to harass the enemy fleets by zipping around all over. They were loaded with torpedoes and machine guns, so the boats were actually able to help take out some of the forces. Not pictured that were also used in the Battle of Crete was the mine-layer ship Abdiel and the submarine Rorqual that helped lay mines to help establish the proper boundary for the enemy forces. Should they make it to that point, it was their hope that these mines would take down some of the forces and give the Allies a better chance at defending the mainland. On May 20th, 1941, the battle for the island of Crete officially begins. Luftwaffe forces began their descent onto the island in the early morning, and they would be conducted into 2 waves of attack. Each wave would be focused on one particular portion of the island, in a particular mission to said portion of the island. Wave 1 would primarily focus on Malim and Kanya on the western part of the island, while Wave 2 focused mainly on the assaults against the eastern part on Rethymnon and Heraklion. The forces were brought in by gliders launched from Greece, which brought the initial count for the waves to be at approximately 6,000 troops for Wave 1. Due to the nature of insertion, paratroopers made extremely easy targets for the Allied forces coming down, seeing as they're suspended by cords and left to Lady Luck to make it to the ground safely. The Luftwaffe were attempting to make a safe landing among being fired upon. It was also said that the paratroopers were also known to get caught in the olive trees and hang there unable to free themselves. Facing these adversities, many of the paratroopers and airborne infantrymen did make it to land safely on the island and begin their missions. The battle itself took just shy of 2 weeks long to start and complete. The assaults began on the 20th, which was a few days later than intended due to resources and miscommunication errors, with the smaller battles for different areas of the island starting and leading on simultaneously from there. Although the final finishing date was June 2nd, many of the Allied forces had finished their withdrawal by May 29th. The rest of what was during the Battle of Crete were the conflicts on the different airfields stationed along the island. The invasion of Heraklion in Kanya was what the Luftwaffe were looking for as their way to try to gain control of the peninsula of Crete, while the battle on Malim, where Hill 107 was to be able to gain control of the airfield, which would also give the Nazis the advantage as far as being able to see their surrounding areas and be better at getting their communications up and going. The Battle of Rethymnon, which started on May 22nd, was where the Allied forces were controlling the advance of the German reinforcements into the western portion of the island. This took place over the next week, to which it came to an end with calling for a withdrawal and retreat from the higher command due to the amount of forces coming in and countering the defending Allied troops. The incoming paratroopers from the skies were somewhat overwhelming to the Allied forces on the Crete. Looking at Dr. Mann's map from his book, Great Battles of World War II, he talks about these progressive steps for the Germans as their invasive forces come onto the island and how the Allies responded. At dawn on May 20th, 1941, the Germans launched an attack intent on securing Maleme and its airfield. This was possible due to their use of gliders to bring in the para forces and other troop-carrying gliders. For Step 2, the fighting at Maleme intensifies. Reinforcements increase the next 2 days. Landings at Rethymnon and Heraklion meet heavy opposition. Allies were prepared for this force and met them head-on, which did end up slowing down the advance for a couple of days. For Phase 3 of the map, Dr. Mann talks about how a German advance links up with paratroopers from the southwest Kanya, but are countered by a force of New Zealanders. Phase 4 is when the Allied forces slowly begin to realize that they are in trouble. The Germans take control of Suda Bay, forcing the Allies to begin their withdrawal from Spakia. On May 29th, through the following day, a British rearguard attempts to maintain their control of the beachhead of the retreat, while the garrison of forces at Rethymnon surrender to the Germans. All of these events end with the removal of troops of the Allied forces and forcing them to go back to Alexandria, where the relief force was stationed. Student decided to split his troops into 3 different battle groups. Each of the groups were assigned to the western, eastern, and center parts of the island. Because of this, Freyberg had to align his forces to meet the Luftwaffe head-on. With a force of 40,000 strong, Freyberg focused on trying to stave off the impeding Germans. The only problems with this are that there were different challenges that were presented to Freyberg. With tired and demoralized troops, many of them were becoming exhausted too quickly and unable to do a whole lot to combat that. They were also losing faith due to the overwhelming amount of Luftwaffe forces that there were coming at them, and many of them were starting to just give up. What also didn't help was that his resources were not in the best shape. The only tanks that they had available to use were sent back from the North Africa campaign, many beaten, battered, and not working as well as they should have been. Without working equipment, it was difficult to launch an effective defense against the Luftwaffe. There also was no air cover that protected the Allied forces from the bombers that were making run-ins in between the drop-in paratroopers. Lastly, there was a constant drop out in communication lines from constant bombardment. Without effective communication, it was hard for Freyberg to effectively be able to command his men to meet the offensive formations, as well as call in for reinforcements when things would start to get hairy. The arrangement of forces did end up changing a small bit as the invasion began. In Eric Grove's literature Sea Battles and Close Up, World War II, Grove states in his text that all of the forces were working to put themselves into place. Under Rear Admiral H.B. Rawlings' command, Force A-1 would have ships Warspite, Valiant, destroyers Napier, Hereward, Decoy, Hero, and Hotspur. This group would combine with Force D and take to the sea on May 14th to begin preparation for the invasion. Force B, under the command of Captain H.A. Rowley, there were the ships Gloucester, Fiji, and destroyers Greyhound and Griffin. This group joined the other two groups on May 16th, bringing the current total of destroyers to 10 ships. Under Command H.A. King's command, Force C consists of Naid, Perth, destroyers Canadar, Kingston, Nubian, and Juno. They made their way towards the Cazo Strait to help add additional support to the area. And finally, under the combination of forces A and D, under the command of Rear Admiral I.G. Glennie, was Dido, Orion, Ajax, and destroyers Isis, Kimberly, Imperial, and Janus, who, as aforementioned, was with Force A. A1 was positioned 100 miles west of Crete, with Force B making their way towards A1. They would then meet about 50 miles west of the coast of Crete on the 21st, just after the battle began. Force D would then be stationed west of the Antikythera Channel. With this plan in place, it was hopeful that the Allies would be able to stop any reinforcements that had any chances of being sent from Italy or the German Navy. One of the biggest pushes that the Luftwaffe made was the assault on Malines. Many paratroopers surprisingly made it to the ground and were able to regroup. Once together again, they rallied around and went on to fight one of the main staples of Malines, which was Hill 107. This was one of the larger hills on the island and was known for its air base on the top of the hill. Taking over this would mean that the enemy would gain the upper hand in being able to communicate with the other groups. The territory did, however, have poor visibility from the hills and was 2 square miles full of other rough territory to traverse and defend. Both sides found extreme difficulty in all of this. It ended up that there was a significant Nazi troop buildup to the southeast portion of the airfield, and that dive bombers helped push and soften the blow that was being done on their foot soldiers. Due to the lack of ammunition, men, and abilities to counter, New Zealand commander Lieutenant Colonel Les Andrew was defeated, and this began the withdrawal of Allied forces from the island of Crete. Churchill had promised that there would be reinforcements for the Allied troops, but not one garrison ever came to assist with the counter-assault. Beginning on May 28, 1941, after a series of battles that were short-lived victories, such as Colonel Howard Kippenberger's counterattack near Galatas and the fall of Malines, the Allies began planning for their departure. Kippenberger was the first to start, as his forces were taking numerous hits and losses from the reinforcements sent from the Luftwaffe, which were approximately 2,000 strong. The higher-ups accepted his request, to where he and the other Allied forces then began their movement into Sudan Bay to begin their departure out of Sfakia. There were British commandos that were flown in to assist with the withdrawal, and they were able to help get about 17,000 troops onto the British ships that were stationed nearby. However, they were unable to get everyone off of the island due to the breaks in communication from the constant barrage of attacks. Many knew too late that the withdrawal was taking place, and many never even knew that it was happening. A lot of the soldiers that could have made it off of the island to safety ended up being caught and surrendering as prisoners of war, which came to an approximated total of 5,000 Allied soldiers. The aftermath of Crete was a brutal hit for the Allies. They lost their main refueling depot in the Mediterranean Sea, lost their bases that would help assist the Allies against the Axis powers in their campaigns in northern Africa, and also made a huge dent in their forces. Overall, the number of soldiers killed in action for the Allied forces were only about 1,750, and a similar number were wounded. However, there were nearly 12,000 prisoners of war from those that were left behind during the withdrawal and retreat from the island initially. The Allies also took a hit with the Luftwaffe managing to sink 9 ships total during the battle. The Germans, on the other hand, lost 4,000 being killed or missing in action. Half of these fatalities happened with the initial drop into Crete, where they were getting picked off by the forces on the ground. Their numbers were not as bad as the Allied powers. However, Hitler decided that this would be the end of the paraforces. The element of surprise was now lost, and now that the world was aware of what the Germans had with the Luftwaffe Fliegerkorps, it was no longer relevant to Hitler to keep them around. The rest of the German forces began to move their way onto Crete to establish themselves, but they were not expecting as much of a resistance as what the Cretan natives had in store for them. The aftermath of Crete Following the complete German occupation of Crete, many of the citizens on the island were understandably angry that the Nazis had taken over the island. Because they had already fought for their freedom not too long before the war, the natives were not about to let the Nazis take that from them again. According to Gregory Papa's post from his article about the Cretan rebels, he mentioned elderly villagers armed themselves with pitchforks, kitchen utensils, and muskets that hadn't been used since Crete's revolution against the Turks a few decades earlier. However, this did not go unnoticed by the German forces, and they often punished the citizens harshly by execution or razing villages. This was a course of action that many German soldiers took against their prisoners, as seen with the Holocaust encampments. Even with this as a part of what the citizens faced, they were able to give the Germans more than they could handle without realizing it. Due to the results of this, the Germans had sent more of their forces to contend with the resistance on Crete. Inadvertently, this caused them to be unavailable in other locations. In the long scheme of things, this helped the Germans lose their fights against the Soviet Union when they attempted to go after them to take their territory, and furthered their downfall and their loss to the Allied powers. In conclusion, do I feel that the Germans made the right move in taking Crete as early as they did? No, I don't think so. I say that because I feel that if they had waited just a few more months, or waited towards the end of the year, maybe the next year, with giving them more time to be able to compile themselves and gain more territory throughout Europe and that part of Asia, I feel that it would have benefited them more because they would have had more resources. They would have been able to better plan their campaign, because I feel like winning Crete for the Germans was one of those things where you're pretty much tossing a stone to a lake. I mean, it didn't do a whole heck of a lot. Considering that their secret weapon, which was the Luftwaffe, was revealed to the rest of the world, do I feel like it would have been effective still had they chosen to use them later on? Yes, but it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. And they also strapped themselves too tight fighting with the resistance on Crete, so they couldn't send the garrisoned forces anywhere else, like Northern Africa, so on and so forth, because they had to deal with their problems on the island that they decided they needed because of the airfield and the refueling stations. Should they have won? It's a hit and a miss. I mean, they played it right. Their strategy was key. They did what they should have. The Allies were overpowered, and I feel that if they had reinforcements sent in, like Churchill was saying they would get and they never received, I feel like the Allies would have actually held out against the Luftwaffe and would have ended up winning in the long run. But thank you for watching my presentation. The next two slides are my works cited for my images that were used and also the references that I used for the text. So thank you again.